Okay, so this closed group tutorial is going to be on multi-way pots, defending properly in multi-way pots, as well as going to touch a bit on exploitation in multi-way pots. The learning outcomes for this tutorial. So first, we're going to discuss how to actually defend multi-way. Another one is we have to figure out how Eevee is distributed across all of our hands and how that differs between multi-way pots and heads-up pots. And then lastly, we're going to talk a lot about, this is going to be the bulk of the session, a lot about how position is going to impact our strategy in multi-way pots. Okay, so I have 3 questions for you. And if any of you can answer any of these questions, just jump straight in. So first one is, how multi-way pots different from heads-up pots? How is the Eevee distribution different in multi-way pots? And how is position important in multi-way pots? So does anyone have the answer for any of these questions?
I think for the first one, for multi-way pots, what's different is that the equity distributions that the players have are spread more evenly. So, you know, pocket aces in a heads-up pot has much more equity than pocket aces in a multi-way pot. So the range advantage isn't as large.
Yeah, okay. That's definitely true. Hands that have a lot of equity might not have as much equity against multiple players as they do in heads-up pots. Anyone else have any ideas about how heads-up and multiple pots are different?
I also find it's easier to sometimes make folds against someone who maybe, say, on a King, Queen, Jack ace board, he's representing a 10. I have to say, 2 guys call, you're like, it's guaranteed one of them has a 10. So I find that sometimes it's easier to make folds as opposed to heads up where, you know, it could go. He could just be making a huge bluff, and you just have to, you know, just put it down. But yeah, sometimes easier to fold, I find.
Yep, in multiple pots, you definitely should be folding more often. And the example that you used there was an overcalling example. And if you're overcalling, then you should definitely fold quite a lot more. Does anyone else have something? Does anyone else have answers to any of the other questions as well?
I think the last one. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think Eevee distribution, like, you know, depends on like what position you're in. Like if you're in the, you know, under the gun to, you know, like to big blind, you know, and then someone who's in the middle, like, you know, it's easier to sort of get like a good range of what they're playing, and when what the board comes up with, you're thinking, right, if he's in under gun, probably got like ace king, ace queen suited, something like that. In mid, if he just calls, flat calls, he's probably have a pocket pair, like, you know, maybe 6s or 7s up, and then big blind, you know, a massive range. So
okay, but how is Eevee distributed amongst the individual combinations of hands? So which hands are going to have a lot of Eevee, and which hands are going to have very little Eevee, and which hands are going to have sort of Eevee in the middle?
Well, that's I would say it's all down to position.
Okay, yeah, position definitely is important. And that's sort of the last question. Does anyone want to talk about how they think position is going to be important in multi-way pots?
I think position is probably even more important in multi-way pots. If you're in position, you get to see all the other players act ahead of you. Much easier to realize your equity. I mean, I know this is true in heads-up pots, but in multi-way pots, just to give you an example, if I find myself out of position in a multi-way pot, I tend to check quite a bit more. I tend to check fold quite a bit, realizing that the player in position most likely has an advantage in multi-way. This may not be always true, but that seems to be my feeling about position.
I'd say that work both ways, because if you're in a multi-way pot and say I'm early position or out of position, for instance, and I have a pocket pair, and then on the flop I hit I hit a set, I'm not going to raise that. I'm going to check it and then let whoever is after me see if they will raise, sort of thing. There's a good chance that one of them will try and force another person out the pot.
Yeah, okay, so there's a bit of what you've discussed there. What do you think about equity now? I think you want to touch on that a little bit, how a player that's in position is going to bet somewhat to deny the equity of the other players. And because of that being out of position, we're going to check more often because the in position player is going to bet for us. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Does anyone have anything else to add?
I'd say on multi-way pots, it's easier on the turn. Once after the flop, once it's checked and everyone say checks, it's easier to make a decision on whether to bet or not with your marginal hands, I would say. I'd say on the turn it's a lot easier. On the flop, there's all sorts of...
Yeah, that's especially true if you have relative position on the pre-flop raiser. So if you're first to act after it checks around on the flop, typically you can steal the pot, especially the pre-flop raiser checks around, and then the turn card comes and it's on you. The decision becomes quite easier to take a stab at the pot.
Yeah. And if the guy check raises as well, you're like, well, he's probably hit a set and he's probably waiting.
Well, the way that Zenith plays, if you guys have looked at the pre-flop ranges, is that we're not going to be in position in a multi-way pot very often, especially not on a multi-way heads-up pot, and we're definitely not going to be doing that if we're not the RFI, the last first raiser in, because our strategy pre-flop is to play through bet or fold against an open basically from every position except for the big blind, because they're closing the action. So that necessarily means that when... Sorry, someone might have a bit of feedback loop. They can turn that down. That necessarily means that if someone opens, we're going to be three-betting them. We're not going to be calling. So there's never going to be a position for us to be in position against the RFI going into a multi-way pot. So most of the multi-way pots that we're going to be playing using the Zenith ranges are ones that either we've opened and there's been multiple callers, or one where we're in the big blind, there's an open and a call, and we decide to complete closing the action. Does that make sense?
I think so,
Yep.
yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
so does anyone else have anything to add in terms of trying to answer these questions?
No, I'm okay at the moment.
All right, in that case, we'll move on. All right, so moving on. When we're in a multi-way pot and we face a bet, the burden of defense is shared between all the players. Okay, and so if we were to look at a sort of like a geometric average of the folding frequency here, F bar, it's just the nth root of the total folding frequency. So, for example, if all the defenders decide to fold against a bet at alpha, then the average folding frequency, F bar, is just going to be the nth root of alpha. And I'll show you that here. So this is the curve for the folding frequency against the bet with the number of players that you're up against. So if you're up against one player, if you're in a heads up pot, n equals 1, the folding curve looks like that, sort of nice and flat and slanted upwards. But you can see immediately as there's a second player, if we add a second player to it, even against a very small bet, we're folding quite a bit. And then as against a third player and a fourth player and a fifth player, we're folding a lot, even against tiny bets. You can see even against a 20% pot bet size, when there's 4 or 5 players in, the average folding frequency is above 60%, even against a very tiny bet. So this basically means that a small bet size will shrink players' ranges by a lot.
Yeah, this is of course assuming, Thomas, that all the players are strong players, and
yeah, we'll get to exploitative play and that later on, but in general, even when we're using a tiny bet, the ranges of players are going to be shrinking up a lot. So if we're going to be doing any of the betting multi-way, using a small bet size is in general ideal, because our opponents' ranges aren't going to shrink as much. And then when we do get into heads up, we can attack those wider ranges more effectively. This also means that when we're bluff catching, when bets are large and there's multiple players in, we can be quite happy letting hands go. Right? We don't have to make these tough decisions with these middle strength hands anymore. All right, so now we're going to talk about the Eevee and multiplayer pots. And if anyone has any questions, they can ask right away. So in multiplayer pots, if you look at the Eevee in a heads up pot, then the equity distribution is going to be a relatively smoothish curve, where strong hands have something around 90% EV, and the weakest hands might have something like 20% EV, right? And 20% equity and 90% equity. But the EV of those hands in a heads up pot is going to be very skewed towards the strong hands. And that's very true in poker, where the EV of our hands is disproportionately skewed towards hands that are very strong. Hands that are weak don't get to see their equity. They don't get to reach the river because of the betting that happens in between. And the hands that are very strong win a pot that is much bigger than the pot that is currently on the flop. And multi-way, that's compounded even further because of this higher folding frequency from all the other players. In a multi-way pot, the EV of hands is going to be super skewed towards the nuts and monster hands. It's not necessarily true that in multi-way pots we should be playing very polarized. It just means that a small bet can get a lot of folds. Doesn't necessarily mean that we should be playing polarized. You'll see that a lot of multi-way play is about equity denial, because there's a lot of players in the pot. We can be betting these marginal top pairs, strongish middle pairs, even like bottom pairs, just to try and get people to fold out their overcards, fold out draws that might beat us. And then we're using a very small size to help with that, right? Because the small size doesn't require as many players to yeah, exactly right. The EV of like a top pair isn't very strong, but it's important to bet these middling strength hands for equity denial. In order to realize that EV, in order to realize their zero EV or whatever, they have to be bet in terms of equity denial. And so you can sort of think about it as a bluff, but it is an equity denial bet. And when you're playing poker, not all, especially on the flop and pre-flop and stuff, not all bets are either bluffs or value. And so you can't polarize like that. And that's especially true multi-way. Where was I? So yeah, these hands with marginal showdown value or a weak draw or a non-nut draw, the EV is going to be close to 0 on the flop. So we should be quite happy letting go with a lot of our range when we're playing multi-way. If we're playing in a live game where you raise pre-flop and then like you get 6 callers, like don't worry too much about that gut shot to the second nuts, because you don't have any deal being in that pot. That's not necessarily how Eevee works, Lorenzo. I'm not sure what you mean by that. Eevee equals close to 0. We better if we think we have fold equity. So fold equity, the way that fold equity works, as I discussed earlier, the defense is shared against multiple players, right?
Yeah.
And using a combination of draws and showdown value hands is the best way. So the draws, they make cheap bluffs, right? In that they're literally less expensive, because if they call, we have a chance to win. And then showdown hands, they can be bet as a bluff or as an equity denial bet, because it makes it difficult for your opponent's draws to call. And so a combination of those means that when you have a very strong hand, you're gonna win a lot of the pot. Not just a lot of the pot, more than the size of the pot. Does anyone have any questions about what I've discussed? Basically, the way that Eevee is distributed in multi-way pots means that we can let go of a lot of our hands. And the way that bet sizing and fold and how often roughly we should be folding means that we should be quite happy about letting go of the majority of our hands on the flop if it's multi-way. So the same kind of thing pre-flop, right? Pre-flop is the clearest example of multi-way, and a lot of what we can learn about how to correctly play multi-way pots post-flop comes from general study of how our pre-flop play works. Does anyone have any questions about this?
Yeah, Thomas, I have a question. So it seems there's a distinction between if you're the pre-flop aggressor or calling in on a multi-way pot. I think if I get what you're saying, it's if you're calling in a multi-way flop, if you're not the pre-flop aggressor, then it's folding is not a bad option if you're not drawing something very strong. I get that, and then if you're the pre-flop raiser, if you're the aggressor, then equity denial, given the fact that the other players will tend to fold quite a bit, even the smaller bets. Equity denial is typically a big motivation here, even if you don't have a very strong hand. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes. So equity denial becomes quite important in multi-way pots, and it's a big part of our EV. The reason is, as we discussed earlier, the EV, the equities of hands runs closer. If you have aces in a multi-way pot, you're not going to have that enormous equity advantage against their range a lot of the time.
I get that. Right. Yeah, the equity
because there's multiple players, right? So betting small to get one or two players to fold and to go to heads up into the next street is an important motivation for us. That's quite important for a reason why we bet. And then the strong hands, the reason why their EV is very high is, one, because they're strong. Two, because when we're betting small, we're quite likely to get raised, right? And having a strong hand being raised means that strong hand is going to have a lot of EV. And so the EV in the strong hands comes from being able to get raised. The EV in these middle hands comes from equity denial type bets. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
And then when we have draws, it's important to draw to the nuts, right? Because if you have a middling, say like a middling flush draw, you draw, you hit your flush, and then you get stacked by a higher flush, right? That kind of stuff isn't what we want. We want to be able to draw to the nuts, and drawing to the nuts is more important. Multi-way is more important when you're playing a game where there's a lot of cards. Like if you're playing PLO, the hands that you play pre-flop are hands that can draw to the nuts easily, right? It's the same sort of thing going multi-way. When you're multi-way, you want to make hands that can draw to the nuts. So having a weak gut shot isn't gonna help you, but having a gut shot to the nuts might, right? It might mean that because of this nuttish draw, even though the draw is relatively weak, it's only 4 outs, it means that gut shot can continue over the preference of a stronger draw that isn't to the nuts. Okay, so we're going to move on to talk a bit about position. So position is very powerful and very important in multi-way pots. Being in position in a multi-way pot is one of the best things you can have. More importantly, it's very bad for you to be playing out of position against multiple opponents, because being out of position against multiple opponents forces you to fold more than the average, right? And in general, the correct and sort of GTO-ish way to defend against a bet in a multi-way pot is to let the player that's closing the action do most of the bluff catching. And you can think of back to what our preflop strategy is, where when we're facing an RFI, if we're not closing the action, we're playing 3-bet or fold. There's a lot of incentive to do something very similar when we're playing multi-way pots. If we're not closing the action facing a bet, then we should think very, very strongly about playing raise or fold. So I've got that here. And that's especially true if we're not in absolute position. So if we were somehow on the button, which in general, using our pre-flop strategy, we won't be. But say, for example, we 3-bet someone and we get a cold caller of our 3-bet. And so we're in a 3-bet pot multi-way. And then the first guy leads or something. No, the second guy leads, right? So the RFI, say, is in the cutoff. We 3-bet, and then the big blind calls for whatever reason, and then the cutoff calls as well. So we're in a multi-way pot, 3-bet pot, and the big blind checks, and then the cutoff leads, right? In general, in this kind of spot, we should be defaulting to playing raise or fold. The player that's closing the action has the biggest burden of defense. But because we're in position, we can think about creating a calling range. Does anyone have any questions about this?
No, it's pretty clear to me.
Okay, so let's go for an example, right? Say we're in the big blind, cutoff opens, the button calls, and then we decide to call as well. We go to a flop. It goes check, check, and then the button bets. When we're in the big blind, even though we have quite a wide range, we should think very hard about playing raise or fold, especially against facing of quite a largish size, closer to half pot. As we said earlier, smaller bet sizes are ones which are preferred, but against a larger bet size, we should think about playing raise or fold because our burden of defense for ourselves is a lot lower. And then the cutoff should be the guy bluff catching because they're closing the action. And in fact, I'm going to do a video on this later on. If we look at findings from a 3-way 0-1 game, if we have a 3-way 0-1 game where out of position and middle position are pacified and only in position can bet, if in position bets, then out of position will call with a range that is tighter than the in position player's value range. And then if they fold, then all the bluff catching is done by middle position. Does that make sense? Not sure if I explained that pretty well, but say we had 3 players.
It makes sense. Yeah.
So we have 3 players out of position, middle position, any position. And I'm going to do a video on this to explain it in a lot more depth later. Out position, middle position, in position. And the GTO strategy for all 3 players, if out of position and middle position are pacified, is that in position player bets, out of position calls with a range that is slightly tighter than in position's value range, and then all the bluff catching is done by middle position. And if out of position calls, then middle position will call with a range that is much tighter than both of the 2 players. So that's another thing that's going on. Even if we are closing the action, if it goes raise call, our calling range needs to be far tighter than the in position player's value range, right? Because the first caller, because they're out of position against us, then what's going on is our range needs to be tighter than both of their ranges in order to continue. So for a more concrete example, say we open the cutoff, the big blind, so the button and the big blind both call, and we check to the button bets, and the big blind calls. Now, when we decide to call over the top or to continue over the top, we need to be quite a lot tighter than at least the big blind's range as well as the button's range, because from what we learn from these principles that we can pick up from a 3-way 0-1 game, the big blind's calling range should be tighter than the button's value range, or tighter in the sense that if we raise, and I'm going to discuss this later, if we raise, they're going to have some hands that are going to re-raise us. And so when we decide to overcall, our range needs to be tighter than both the button's value range as well as the big blind. And so when thinking about value, it's important to be very sensitive to how big these bet sizes are. So when we're facing a sort of like a half pot bet size for multiway pot is huge, right? If you face a half pot bet size, you can't really call out of position because of the chance that you're going to get one squeezed by middle position or overcalled by middle position. And so if we just decide instead we're going to play raise or fold, and our range is going to be tighter than the in-position player's value range, then we'll do pretty well for ourselves. But against smaller bet sizes, we might not have enough value in our range to be able to play raise or fold. So this means that we're going to have to construct a calling range. So when we're constructing a calling range, we need to think about being squeezed by the player behind or overcalled by the player behind. And so we need to have some hands in our range that trap in with the intention of re-raising a squeeze. So for example, that we had earlier, we're in the big blind, cutoff opens, button calls, we overcall. Then we check, the cutoff checks, and then the button bets small. If we have a calling range, we should have some hands that trap the cutoff because of the cutoff squeezes. We can jam over the top or something like that. As well as some hands that can call if the button decides to fold. Does anyone have any questions about the last few slides?
Thomas, just to test my understanding, you're in this case you're talking about if the button decides to call, that his calling range needs to include hands that needs to consist of hands that have equity.
Whenever we decide to call in a multiway pot and we're not closing the action, we need to be uncapped because the player behind us can squeeze, and so we can have some hands that can trap to 3-bet the squeeze.
Yeah, okay, I get that. And then the hands that are within that calling range, that are not the trapping hands, those calling hands need to be ahead of 50% of the button's value range.
No, it's not 50% of the button's value range. It's just slightly ahead of the button's value range.
Oh, right, okay. So just more equity than the button's value range. Okay.
No, not more equity than the back one. Right. So say it's difficult when you have multiple streets, but if you can think of the flop as a street where you have a bunch of value bets and then a small amount of bluffs, and then on the turn, some of those value hands get converted into bluffs, and some of those go into turn value. But basically, you need to call, if you're out of position, you need to call tighter than the in position player's value range, slightly tighter.
Mhm.
Right? If you can estimate where the absolute bottom of what would be considered a value hand, then you would call roughly there.
Yeah, I got it. Okay.
Is not Lorenzo, if we're closing the action, then it's okay for us to be relatively capped on that street because the next street will bring in some of the draws. But if we're not closing the action, then it's important for us to not be capped, because if we are capped, that means that the middle position player can raise us, right, and kick us out of the pot, and they only really have to worry about being 3-bet by the in position player. So we should have some hands in our range that have the intention of re-raising a squeeze. And you can see this happens quite a bit in multi-way preflop sims, where if we let the button have a calling range against an RFI, so it goes RFI, button calls, and then one of the blinds squeezes, right? If one of the blinds squeezes and then either a call from the RFI or fold from the RFI, usually if there's a fold from the RFI, there are some back raises in the button's range. So multi-way simulations you can do using Monka Solver. I think Monka Solver is the only software right now that can do multi-way simulations. Poker Snowy is okay for...
Poker Snowy also. There are just 2 options.
Yeah, those are the main 2 options. Poker Snowy is okay, but it's kind of passive, right? It likes to flat a lot and then hope it doesn't get wrecked by the guy behind it. So you can learn a lot from Poker Snowy in terms of like learning how to play tight, right? Because Poker Snowy plays tight enough in multi-way pots to not get itself destroyed. And so if you played exactly like Snowy in multi-way pots, you'd probably play better than like 99% of all players that you're ever going to face, right? But if you want to beat those extra 1%, then you have to start thinking about the base theory behind it and looking at multi-way sims. Okay, does anyone have any questions before we move on to the hand histories?
I'm fine.
All right, so who wants to be first to show their hand history? Lorenzo, you don't have one up yet, so maybe you can look in your database in the meantime and try and find one.
Okay, yeah.
So George,
I'm happy to go with.
All right, I'll swap to your screen, and what you have to do is just put the hand history up on your screen for everyone else to see. So you can share screen in the top left of the Google Hangouts page. There should be like a green arrow thing.
Okay, bear with me a second. Sorry, where do I see that, Thomas?
So if you move your mouse over the Hangouts, on the left-hand bar, the second one down, it's like a green screen with a white arrow.
I'm on my iPad, which probably isn't too helpful.
Okay, no mind about that then. I'll pull it up.
Yeah, next time I'll get on my my laptop. C8 Jack of Diamond hands. Yeah, you see it?
Oh yeah, I like this one.
Okay, so the way I'll discuss this hand is I'll try to kind of just play back what goes through my mind as I play that hand live, as opposed to as I sit back and analyze this hand after the fact, because often, I guess it's the case for everybody, that what you're thinking as you go through it live is completely different than what you're thinking when you look at it afterwards and you have a bit more time to react. So in this case, you know, I'm in middle position. There's a fold. I raise to just over 2 big blinds. I get a call out of the cutoff ahead of me, and the small blind calls. And I look at a king 3-9 flop. The first thing that goes through my mind when I look at the flop and I look at the fact that I'm the pre-flop raiser is I look at the flop texture and I try to think to myself, okay, you know, who has range advantage in this scenario? And I'm open for criticism here. I'm just you know, running you through my thought process as I play the hand live. And I look at it and say, well, I'm a middle position open, so I certainly have kings. I certainly have nines. I could certainly have sets of threes as well. So I certainly have aces. I have ace king. I have both range advantage and nut advantage. Although some of the other players could have nuts, I could also have these nuts as well. So I look at that flop and I say, okay, for my range, I can comfortably bet here, because I feel like I can convey range advantage and also having nut hands. I then look at the actual hand I have, and I say, okay, I'll throw a bet in because I've got a backdoor to a flush draw. I also have some equity if should I pick up a straight draw on the way. So I go ahead and make my bet, and I get a call out of the cutoff. So I'm still out of position here, and the small blind calls. I look at the turn card, which, looking at it through my mind, I'm thinking, okay, in terms of my strong hands, it doesn't really change anything. I still retain the the range advantage, but in addition, this card helps my particular hand from a bluff perspective. I pick up some equity, so I decide to throw in another bet. And my plan there is that if I get a call on the turn, and the river basically is a brick, doesn't really improve anything in either caller's range or my range, then I think I could set myself up for a river jam, because I'm thinking in this case that the cutoff caller in this case, and in the small blind, they're basically capping their ranges on a fairly dynamic board. That's how I'm looking at it on the turn. The river comes a good card for me. It completes the straight, and I go ahead and go all in basically, and I get 2 folds. So that's how I try to think as I'm playing the hand. And that's basically how I looked at it.
Okay, so that's how you thought about it when you played the hand. What did you think about afterwards?
Yeah, good question. So I look at it afterwards, and I guess the first thing I try to think about is that, okay, well, could I have a checking range here? Do I need to protect my checking range if I decide to check back this flop? And I would think, okay, well, I try to think about it a bit more deeply, and I say, okay, well, I could conceivably check back some aces, perhaps with the ace of hearts, so I would have some redraws. maybe check back. Ace King, once again with a heart for the redraw. And I think about this particular hand. When I look at the hand itself, I say, well, I probably don't have a checking range here because if I should face a bet, I really don't have a. If I face a bet and call here, it kind of caps my range, so I'm not really feeling too happy about that. And I'm not sure I want to put in a. In other words, if I put in a checking range, what could I check raise with? What could I check call with? So not too sure. There could be another way for me to play this, but I could be way off.
All right. Does anyone else have any analysis? Anyone else have see anything glaringly wrong with this hand? Okay, so when I look at this hand, I first think about what we're doing with our entire range. Okay, so when we are here with the preflop raise and we face a call in position, and then we face an overcall from the blinds. So we're in middle position going forward. First, we have to think if we check. So if we check, how often is the imposition player going to bet on this board? Right. And this is a very important question for us to think about, because if the imposition player is going to bet very often, then there's no point in us checking. There's no point in us betting ourselves because the imposition player can put the money in for us. And you'll find that if we end up in multi-way pots when we're out of position against multiple players, a lot of the time we should check our entire range, or we can exploitatively bet small with like a 12-hour range and then just fold the rest of it, essentially. But we first have to answer, when we're looking at the ranges, is the imposition player going to bet frequently? Okay, because if the imposition player is going to bet frequently when we're in middle position, it's better for us to just check our very strong hands with the intention of raising them instead of betting them ourselves, because we win more EV doing that. Say we bet 5.6 or whatever, and then we face a fold from the other two players at roughly the correct frequency. But if instead we checked and then the imposition player is just going to bet very often, and then we win their bet and we can just raise. So if we have something like pocket kings, a check raise would be better than betting, because the imposition player is going to bet quite frequently, and so our check raise is going to be more successful, and so we win more EV doing that.
Oh yeah, you're right.
Okay,
but on this texture, I don't know how the button constructed is calling range, but it doesn't seem like a texture in which imposition is going to bet that often, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, it definitely depends on how these ranges are constructed, and we can talk about exploitative play as well. Okay, then secondly, when we make this bet, if we think back to what I talked about earlier in terms of bet sizing, this bet is far too big, right? Because if we have a hand like aces, if we bet this size, we're not sure what we're up against on the turn, because someone for sure can small blind or cutoff for sure can have a set after we bet this big, even though there's a flush draw and a straight draw. So we'd much prefer to bet a lot smaller over the one of the players behind us fold, and that allows us to bet a wider range for value as well. So if we bet very small, something like a quarter of the pot, like what someone likes to do a lot in multi-way pots, or like 20% of the pot, something tiny, we can go quite wide. We can bet a lot of our King X type hands, definitely King X with a heart. We can bet some of our stronger 9X hands, definitely 9X of diamonds, right, which we have a lot of if we're raising Jack 8 suited from the hijack, then we're definitely raising Jack 9, 10 9, possibly 9 8, right? And so we're going to have the diamond versions of them a lot. And then there's a question about whether or not you have Ace of Hearts 9. Probably not. from his position. So those can be bet as well for a small size, a thin value against one of the players, and then hoping to check the turn and play a little bit more pot control-y. So a lot of it, when we're betting with the bluff, it's important to think about what we're also doing with our value hands at that stage. And multi-way, it's not very necessary to get real fancy and have multiple bet sizes when we're playing multi-way, because that just complicates things for us. It's, as a human, probably better to focus on playing one bet size relatively well than it is to play multiple bet sizes poorly. And multi-way, that's especially true. So when you guys play multi-way pots, from now on, I would suggest you just default to a small bet size, something like 20% to 1/3 on the flop, and be pretty happy with that. Now, here we bet.
I can see, Thomas, so sorry, I can see where the theory brings us out. And it's interesting because it's what's being suggested here is counterintuitive, really. I think I tend to approach, well, wrongly, that more players in the pot means that smaller bets increases the likelihood of somebody continuing. And the idea would be to drive people out of the pot with your value hands. But I can see where the theory says, bet smaller because the continuing ranges need to be higher given that it's multi-way.
Yeah, I don't know who taught you that if you have a value hand, you want people to fold. Yeah, I'm just not sure what's going on there. Usually, if you have a strong hand, then you want people to call. Equity denial is a different thing, right? Equity denial, we're not trying to get people to fold. We're just trying to get people to pay for their draw, right?
Right.
We're not trying to get them to fold.
Yeah.
It's not necessary for them to fold to deny their equity, right? As long as they pay for the draw, we're quite happy with ourselves.
Yeah, I guess. Right. Equity. I mean, I guess like a quarter pot or a third pot. To me, that gives pot odds for the draws, right? You don't want to get pot odds.
Okay. Well, it's difficult for cutoff to call because small blind might squeeze.
Right.
Right. So
I hear what you're saying.
right there, it's difficult. Okay, so even if we use a small size like quarter pot, sure, the draws might call, but like we've got all of our stronger draws in our range as well. And so when they hit and we just bet, they're still not having a good time for themselves, right? Or if they get squeezed by the player behind, then they're not going to have a good time either, or overcalled by the player behind as well.
Mm-hmm.
So multi-way betting small is okay, because it kicks out the imposition player, kicks out the player that isn't closing the action. It forces them to play their hands more aggressively, right? As we discussed earlier, if we're facing a bet multi-way and we're not closing the action, we should seriously consider players playing our entire range as raise or fold. And so this means that you say we're in the cutoff in this exact hand. This would mean that if I have a king queen type hand, I would just click it up to try and kick the small blind out, right? Or if I have a weak flush draw, right? I'm not sure what my range would be here because I'm probably not calling here pre-flop. But if I have a 4-5 of hearts, I'm just gonna fold that because it's not drawing to the nuts, right? And so I'm losing to all the flush draws in the better's range, as well as all of their value hands, right? As well as all of their showdown hands. So it doesn't make any sense for me to call a weak flush draw there. And then sort of the middling flush draws have a difficult time, because if I call then and the small blind calls over the top, or small blind squeezes, I'm sort of just screwed. So then as a cutoff, I'm thinking, okay, well, basically this means that I want to just click it up with any hands that I choose to continue with. And those hands are going to be, if you look at the theory, roughly a little bit tighter than the better's
weakest value hand. Yeah.
Weakest value hand, right? A little tighter than that. So if you can sort of consider like an ace 4 of hearts a value hand, which it sort of is, right? It's 50 something percent against most hands, and here it's going to have like 40ish% against the two other players. It's definitely closer towards value than it is a bluff, but you can think of it as a semi bluff. So if cutoff has a heart, the nut heart draw, then the cutoff is going to at least call them, probably raise as well. And then the small blind, moving over to the small blind, analyzing what the small blind is going to do. After the cutoff calls, the small blind's range should be like super nutted here, right, in order to overcall, because of what we've just discussed. The cutoff can't call weak heart draws because of the chance that small blind squeezes. And so when thinking about which heart draws the cutoff is going to call, they're going to call sort of the stronger ones, right? And so the small blind can't call with a heart draw that's weaker than like the nut flush draw or like the king high flush draw here, because of the chance that one of the two other players has a stronger flush draw, and so if they hit, they get stacked.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So the cutoff, for example, what might he do if he had like a king 10 suited hand or something like this, king jack suited?
So if I was in the cutoff and I had like king jack, I would probably raise it. I'll click it up
Interesting.
because I want to kick the small blind out.
Yeah, and I can see the
And
theory behind it.
I'd be pretty happy. Yeah, I'd be pretty
equity's
happy folding a whole bunch of my hands. I'm not sure what cutoff would have, right? Because I would never call preflop here in either of these two positions, right?
Yeah.
A lot of the strategy, the preflop strategy in Zenith is avoiding these multi-way, multi-way pots.
And
general.
the king 10, king jack of heart, reason being that the equities are running fairly tight together. So there could be a raising range with king 10, king jack of heart, or king 10, king jack suited. It's interesting. Yeah, I get it.
Yeah, you just click it up, and we know that those hands are a little bit, at least match the value range of the hijack here of hero of MP. Right, so they can raise it up, with the intention of kicking out the small blind, and then if MP calls, they're going to play pot control on the next street.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of like another thing with the large size that you've used. If cutoff can decide to start calling, because with this larger size you look very polar, cutoff can call because they know small blind should fold a lot, but of course small blind called anyway. Anyway. So small blind overcalling after cutoff calls. This basically means that small blind has a very strong hand. At least they should have a very strong hand. They should have a very strong draw, a draw close to like a nut heart draw, or something like I guess you've got the jack of diamonds, so something like a nut gut shot with a backdoor flush draw of some sort, right? Those are the kinds of hands that small blind should at least have. I'm not even sure that a gut shot makes any sense to call here without a heart draw. So if they have like jack 10 of hearts, yeah, then this is okay for them to call because of the gut shot, as well as the heart draw, even though the heart draw isn't very strong at all, right, after cutoff calls. Because if you can imagine that the weakest heart draw that cutoff calls is like the 10 high heart draw, then small blind can't call any 10 high heart draws.
Mm-hmm.
And then like jack high heart draws get sort of dicey as well, so they can't really call them. So we're sort of thinking that the weakest heart draw that small blind can have is sort of jack 10 of hearts because of that gut shot. They definitely can't have jack 8 of hearts, and then sort of like queen x of hearts is sort of probably not it shouldn't be in their overcalling range either.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Where are we? And in terms of showdown type hands, small blind definitely shouldn't have a 3. Them having a 9 is also pretty suicidal. So small blind should have in order of a king in terms of their showdown. So we're thinking, if we're doing some range analysis, the weakest sort of hand that in terms of showdown that small blind should have is a king, because they have to beat both heroes value range and Cutoff's calling range, right? And Cutoff's calling range beats heroes value range, or at least matches heroes value range. So small blind has to be tighter than heroes, the weakest hand in heroes value range. So if
Right.
the weakest hand in heroes value range is like a Jack 9 of diamonds, then small blind never has a 9. And because Cutoff probably has a bunch of kings, small blind has to have as a hand stronger than King 10 in terms of something like King 10 in terms of made hands in order to overcall. So you can see how quickly the ranges got real tight.
Yeah.
If it was heads up, then and we bet, so the small one wasn't in this hand. It was just us and Cutoff. If we bet, then Cutoff can have like a whole bunch of crap. They can have like pocket eights, like 9x, 4-3 or whatever if they have that in their preflop range. But because small blind's in, Cutoff has to be really tight and small blind has to be really tight. And so the ranges got really tight really quickly because of the call and the overcall and your bigger bet size. Any questions about the flop before moving on to the turn?
Nope, that's well explained.
Okay, so then moving on to the turn. So I get you pick up your diamond equity, but at this stage, because of how tight small blind is, I'm just going to give up with the vast majority of all my bluffs. And the reason behind this is because my value is no longer value, right? My value on the flop after Cutoff calls and small blind overcalls is no longer value on the turn. First of all, on the flop, I would have used a smaller bet size with a wider value range. But say, for example, I used a tighter value range and this bigger bet size. After the Cutoff calls and the small blind overcalls, now going onto the turn, my value has shrunk tremendously. Like when I might have value bet a King 10 or a 10 on a diamond type hand, now my value has shrunk to like sets, good 2-pair type hands. And this just means I have to give up so many bluffs.
Yeah, basically getting it's a tighter value range. Yeah.
Yeah, because of the tighter value range, you just have to give up a lot of bluffs. So you have to be really selective about which bluffs you use. And you're still out of position against Cutoff, so you want to protect that checking range as well. So you're going to have some check raises against Cutoff, which I didn't mention on the flop. I did actually when we were talking about whether the Cutoff is going to bet after we check.
Yeah.
So on the flop, if I wanted to have some check raises, then I would have some kings, some nines, probably not as many threes, pocket threes, and then like some king nine, some ace ace, maybe not even ace ace. Maybe ace ace was like, yeah, maybe not even ace ace. Ace ace might just check call, right? So
if my turn value range is much tighter now, given the calls, what does that mean for my bet sizing on the turn?
Yeah, your bet sizing has to go down as well. Like your bet sizing should be down because it's still multi-way, right? And then if you want to have a wider value range, try and deny equity, right? You want to deny equity as frequently as possible, not just using a large size. Remember, if denying equity is about getting them to pay for their draws to see the next street, not just to get them to fold. So we want to use a smaller size. So you use quite a large size here. I would still keep, because it's still multi-way, keep it closer to quarter pot if I want to bet again. And often after I see call and overcall, I'm giving up with a lot of my value hands. I'm just really scared now because I should be, because of how tight we discussed small blind should be. And some of my very nutted hands that just want to check jam or something if Cutoff decides to bet. And so because my value range is tighter by a lot, I can't bluff as frequently. And so I have to be very selective with my bluffs. And diamonds might make a lot of sense as a bluff because the other two players might not have as many diamonds. And so when the diamond comes, we'd be pretty happy getting it in with the jack high flush draw. So with the jack high flush. But we do have a lot of other diamond type hands in our range, like an ace 3 of diamonds, an ace 9 of diamonds, queen nine of diamonds, which is better than this, as well as some of the heart draws which we could use as bluffs, and some showdown type stuff which we can now turn into a bluff. Like sometimes we could think about turning a 9 to a bluff, like especially like a something 9 of diamonds can be turned into a bluff now, because that not only gets value against a heart draw if the heart draw misses. Say the small blind has ace 5 of hearts and we've got jack 10 of diamonds. If we bet, the cutoff folds and the small blind calls, it's really good for us. Once the brick comes, we can just check back and we win the pot against this heart draw. So it's a mixture of getting value using that showdown plus draw type hand and folding out stronger hands, folding out king X type hands, which can't continue now because we're betting into 2 players again. Is there any questions about that? So I would give up this hand up on the turn.
Give up on a turn. Yeah.
Yeah, and then when it gets to the river after it goes call over call again, I have no idea what the other 2 guys are doing, because this should almost never happen. When you're playing against decent players, so I have no idea what their ranges are going to look like on the river.
Which was not the case
you
here.
you just jam and then like you win. So I guess you got lucky that both players are not good.
Yeah. So on the flop, nines. If I had nines, that could be included in my value range, provided I'm betting small, as the multi-way theory indicates.
Pocket nines.
No, I mean ace 9 or king 9. I'm sorry, queen 9 or hands like that.
Definitely if they had the diamond. If they were like king 9, x 9 of diamonds, you would put them into your flop value range, flop thin value range, because of that backdoor diamond draw. You want to have some backdoor diamond type hands in your range, and so using those makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good analysis. I mean, that's something quite new for me, looking at in a multi-way pot, thinking about betting smaller. That's a very interesting concept.
Thomas, I have a question.
Yep.
What is the value bluff ratio in multi-way pots on the flop? If we can talk in these kind of ways.
It gets difficult to talk about value bluff ratios.
Yeah.
Value bluff ratios on the flop turn river doesn't make any sense unless you're perfectly polar or you're playing your range as if you're perfectly polar, and you don't often do that unless you're on the turn anyway. So when you think about it, it's better to think about it as I have flop value in that I can bet these hands and I'm going to win the pot more often than I'm going to lose if they decide to continue. So that's what my flop value looks like. And then there's bluffs with that, using the bluff to value ratio, which you use on that bet size. So if you consider, so like a jack 9 of diamonds, 10 9 of diamonds as the bottom of your value range, and you build that upwards, and then you pick out some hands which you're going to use as check raises and check calls, and then you have that, and say that's X number of combos for your value range, and you also have some heart draws as well. Some of the nut heart draws you can consider value at this stage because of how much equity they have against multiple players. And if you're going to think it 1/3 of the time and then just stack them, you can count that as value, right? And then there's some sort of bluffs. You would balance your bluffs to your value using your bluff to value ratio, which you calculate on the flop using your flop bet size. So if you're betting a very small size, the majority of it is going to be value and thin value, and then you're just going to have some like junky hands which you use as bluffs.
Yeah, I understood it. Makes sense.
And like the junky hands might be like 8s with a heart, some weird shit which you just hope to bang out a set and then stack some dude with 2 pair. And then when you get to the turn, you're going to have to reevaluate what you count as flop, what you count as value, and what you count as bluffs. All right, does anyone have any questions about this before we move to the next hand? I think. I think Chris, this is your hand. So do you want to have a chat to us about what you were thinking about when you were playing this hand? No, I don't have Monk on.
So basically, you studied with Snowy.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah, Snowy.
Okay.
The preflop ranges which I have are built based on a Monk sim which I've seen. You can download Monk for free and then look at some of there's like free stuff which you can have a look at, and so you can get some principles from that.
Mm-hmm. Monker. Solver.
Chris, did you want to talk about this hand?
Chris is muted.
Okay, well maybe he's not with us anymore. Let's just have a talk about this hand then. All right, so what's going on? So there's a limp from the cutoff, and then we ISO king queen in the small blind, and then the big blind flats, and then the cutoff flats on top of that. Okay, so and then we flop two pair on this connected high board.
Mm-hmm. Fold.
So it goes check, bet, call, call, and then check, bet, call, call, check, bet, fold, call. All right. So does anyone have any opinions about this hand, knowing what we discussed earlier? So I can see some glaring mistakes post flop, which hopefully you guys should be able to see by now.
Oh, okay. The bet size.
Yep. So this is definitely a mistake from our opponent about the bet size that they've decided to use.
Is very large.
Yep, it's very large for multi-way.
Okay, so what else is late 82? Is small blind. Oh, okay. He checked in the small blind, so he didn't continuation bet.
Okay, what do you think about the decision to not continuation bet?
To be honest, okay, so I'm not very good at multi-ways, and my default strategy is to check my whole range. But
Yep, and that's not a bad strategy multi-way if you're up against two players and you're in a position against both of them. It's not a bad idea to do that in terms of you're not going to lose too much in terms of players who could have being able to exploit you by checking your entire range on the flop if you're out of position against 2 or more players. Just because the in-position players is going to bet quite frequently, and so we can play our range out of a check raise, check call, check fold type thing instead of having to worry about having a betting strategy.
Yeah.
So let's just say, for example, that Hero here has decided to check his entire range, and now he faces this very large bet and a call.
Okay. Yeah. Exactly how it happened.
Yep. So what
I
do you think
suppose.
about this decision to call?
Okay, Vlad is big blind. Okay, router calls. I think it looks fine, even though I don't know how Vlad plays. If he might have Ace Jack and Jack 9 in his range, that's possible. I don't know if he's a fish or not. Yeah, I think I like the call here. What do you think about it?
Well,
I also expect
I
Vlad
may, I may be totally off here, but I like a raise here.
Yep. Okay. So we're completing the action. So when we call, we're definitely going to see the turn card. Raising. Why are you raising?
to deny equity and to prevent to see another card.
Yep. Okay. So you can prevent the other 2 guys from drawing out. But what are they going to draw with?
Well, they might have some open-ended draws there with backdoor flush draws, maybe. Jack.
Straight is Ace Jack and Jack 9.
Yeah.
And we don't even know if he squeezes Ace Jack suited. I mean, possibly he does it, but we don't know if the guy is a fish or not, because he probably is a fish because he pots in this 3-way as a big blind. I mean, I don't know. He might have a lot of straights, to be honest, because he has also Jack 9 offsuit and probably also Jack 9 suited. So
Okay. So if we're thinking that he's not a fish, just assume like it's pretty obvious that they're both fish with the hands that they showed up with. But let's just assume they're not fish for now, and then we can worry about how to exploit them if they're fish. So if they're not a fish, and then the guy pots it, and then there's a call, how much harder do we have to be? Sort of think about what their value range is, what their value hand is that they're representing. Okay, so first off, I want you guys to tell me what the calculation for alpha bar here is. The folding frequency against this bet.
So that we're heads
well,
up.
he basically potted, so in heads up he will defend 50% of our range.
And then multi-way?
So multi-way, don't remember actually.
So we just take the square root of that. So we're folding 50%, so we take the square root of that.
Probably 25%. 25% we call.
So 0.5 square root. So we fold 70%. So the first player folds more than 70%. Okay. The reason why they're folding more is because this is the average, right? And they have us to do the bulk of the bluff catching. But you can use this number to think about value range has to be. How strong this big blind guy's value range has to be. If both players are folding 70% on average, then how much stronger does the value have to be when to make this bet? It has to be pretty damn strong, right? No one's agreeing with me that the value has to be pretty damn strong in order to make this bet, because both players should just fold a lot. And so with that very strong value range, the player that calls here, in a cutoff, even though they've got absolute position, their calling range is going to be pretty tight. It's going to be, they have to fold, they're going to be folding 70% at minimum because we still are left to act behind.
Yeah.
So if you think about the cutoffs range here, which is like a limp calling range or whatever. But there are players that can play limp call ranges reasonably well. They're folding at least 70% of that. And so then when we decide to call over the top, our range has to be much tighter than both of their ranges. Like, it definitely has to be a little bit tighter than the big blind value range on the flop. So do we think that the value that the big blind here can bet pot with a king queen or a king 10 type hand?
It shouldn't do it in theory.
Yeah, it shouldn't often, but maybe do you think summertime?
I think he could some of the time. Certainly not pot, but I mean, ideally now, based on the theory you've covered, if he is going to bet, he should be betting much smaller, right?
Yes, I agree. But what do you think in terms of what do you think the value range looks like for this size? Is king queen within that range? Because if king queen is within that range, then we know that our hand is near the bottom of their value range.
Yeah, I think king queen might just sneak in, but I think just based on the bet size, we're probably looking at straights. Ace jack jack nine, ace jack jack nine.
Okay, so knowing that if the value range is a straight and the imposition player has bluff catched for us, do we have to bluff catch?
No, we certainly shouldn't be raising. Haven't thought this through now.
Yeah. Okay. So we thought it through a bit more, and I would be pretty happy with folding, or if I'm raising knowing that I'm bluffing. Does that make sense for everyone in terms of that analysis? And then once we get to the turn, yeah, it's a pretty easy fold. I don't know what's going on there. Let's say we have like a set of tens or whatever, right? Then a set of tens might be a bit harder because we can draw to a boat or quads. But just having a two pair hand, especially not the top two pair, like if they have like somehow ace king, or like if they've got queen 10 specifically of diamonds, then it gets tough to decide what to do. But with king queen, it's quite an easy fold.
So
Sets not
Thomas,
so much.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but I mean, just rewinding the tape a bit, is one of the big problems to start with is that the hand was checked?
No. We discussed earlier on that if we're out of position against two players, it's okay to have a base strategy about defaulting a default strategy about checking our entire range.
Right. Okay.
And the reason why that is because the imposition player is going to bet for us, and so we can play our strong hands using a check raise instead. It's really only in spots where we expect the two players that are in position to check back a lot, then we want to have a betting range.
When we make that decision, we're making that decision thinking about our entire range rather than the hand in front of us.
Yes. So king queen, it looks nice. We got top two, but if we know that the players are going to bet for us, then why should we bet?
Right.
There's not. The only reason is equity denial, right? Then that's the reason why we're betting. And so if we're betting, we would bet a small size because we don't have to bet too big in order to deny the equity. And it's pretty obvious once they get there. So if we bet like quarter pot, and then this ace comes, we're just giving up a lot with king queen, right? One, because we have a lot of jack X ourselves, and 2, we have a lot of sets ourselves that can call instead, and 3, probably because we have some better 2 pairs and flush draws that can call. So that's not a totally different line, but in this line, checking is okay, and after it goes pot call, I'm much happier just letting it go.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Does anyone have another hand they want to talk recently? Some of you guys might play live. Yeah, I'll show you guys the math formula.
I have another hand I could send if you want to have a look at it. I mean, it's.
Yep, send it. So this is
I'll put it in your messenger.
Yep. So this is the multi-way indifference. So this gives us a guide as to how strong value hands should be.
Thank you, Thomas.
Yep. So if it's like a half pot bet, then alpha is going to be 50. Sorry. So if it's a pot size bet, then alpha is going to be 0.5. So it's just 0.5 to the power of half. Yeah, so you're going to be continuing with the top 30%. And so we discussed earlier, we want strong hands and nut draws. Right, so here, so in the cutoff, I'll get the hand back up again.
Thomas, my question is pretty general. I mean, even in other situations, how is your strategy to visualize your range? I mean, do you have another computer in which you have your ranges, or you just use your mind and you can see exactly where you are at in your range? I don't know if I can explain it perfectly.
Yeah, when you get very experienced at analyzing a hand off the table, you get really good at knowing how to do it on the table. Like, so you it's not that I'm actively analyzing my range while I'm playing. I've done enough analysis off the table that I know on the table roughly where I'm at.
Okay. So it's basically what I'm doing.
So here, if I was playing and I'm playing against a bunch of weaker players, I would raise it as a bluff. Right? If I'm playing against a bunch of stronger players, I'd probably fold it and just go with sets and straights. And I know it seems a bit tight, but that's just what the math says we should be doing.
Yeah.
All right. So this one, did you want to have a talk about what your thought process is?
Yeah, I think I probably have to go through now with my revised thought process based on what I've learned. So I guess the first thing that could be called into question is, me squeezing here from the small blind. But assuming we agree it's okay to do that, essentially I'm in the small blind, and we've got a under the gun raise button call. I'm in the small blind, and I decide to squeeze ambitiously with 5-6 of diamonds. I get 2 colors under the gun in the button. I check the flop. My thinking here, I've got a double gut sharp. And incorrectly, that put me immediately in an aggressive frame of mind without even thinking about ranges, where I was going to look to check, let some other people bet, and then go for a check raise. But I did not get a bet. It checked through. Turn comes a 7 of spades, giving me a straight. I decided to put out a bet for a bit less than half pot. Get a call from the button. 9 comes. Put out another small bet. I think at this point, my thinking is I'm thinking about possibly a better straight completing. Well, I'm probably wrong about that. And I get raised and I call. So now going back and looking at this hand,
Yeah, okay. So what do you think about this hand going back?
yeah, going back. Out of position. Got 2 players behind me on the flop.
What do you think about your check? So this is a multi-way 3-bet pot, and you're out of position. So it's
Yep.
going to suck for you. So what do you think about your check?
Well, I've got to think in terms of what would I do with my value range. And what I would do with my value range is, if I wanted to try to put in a bet, I would know that my other 2 players would have very tight continuing range, just based on what we've learned here.
Okay, so what do you think is the weakest hand you can bet for, like, which hand's the weakest thing? Which hand is the weakest hand you can bet for 3 streets? Do you think?
Yeah, well,
Do you think you'd be able to get away with betting aces for 3 streets? Is sort of the question that I'm asking. And then getting called by enough worse multi-way.
yeah. I think I could
It's sort of a trick question, because it really does depend on what the other 2 players are playing.
Yeah, I think I could actually, if I sized the bets correctly. If I size too big, then I'm really forcing them to be selective about their continuing range. So I think a small bet on the flop, turn, and river could get calls from jacks and tens.
Yep. Okay. And now the next thing to think about is, if we check, how often are the other 2 players going to bet for us? And
Well,
does that help us increase? Are they going to bet weaker hands for us? Is really what I'm asking.
Yeah, I think in the games that I play,
Are they going to check back like nines or jacks here?
I think they're likely to bet. I would not be surprised if I, as a raiser, if I check that flop, I'm likely to see a bet, likely to bet for me.
Yep. So if they're likely to bet for you, then checking aces is makes some sense.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty happy with your decision to check on the flop. It checks through, and now the turn comes the 7 of spades, bringing you the nuts.
Yep. Now,
So
just range,
now think about now think about your decision to bet, right? So what's changed between the flop and now in terms of the ranges of the 2 players behind you? So if we've checked our entire range, our range hasn't changed. What's changed in their range?
Well, I could probably say to myself that there would have been unlikely to have checked back draws themselves, straight draws themselves. They would have been unlikely to check back. This is on the flop, a top pair hand. So even just thinking about my entire range, thinking about my aces and kings, given that unlikelihood, I could probably put in a bet on that turn, even with my aces and my kings. because I would have expected a bet from either their top pair hands or their draws on the flop. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay. Now the next thing to think about is if you check, are they going to bet for us? Are they going to bet a weaker hand for us? And how often are they going to do that? So if we've got aces or kings, what do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. Give it, they check the flop.
Or they
I think, yeah.
and this is the sort of exploitative thinking here.
I could count on the turn probe, yeah. Possibly, I don't know. I'm showing weakness twice if I check.
Or could it just get to the stage where they've got pocket fives, they've got ace four, and they're just going to check it down and hope that they win against your ace king?
Mm.
So on the flop, yeah, aces, checking a lot more reasonable. On the turn, probably not as much because they're just going to check back a lot more often than on the flop. One, because they don't have as many of those strong hands in terms of those strong hands that are weaker than your aces, like the overpairs. And two, they don't have to worry as much about equity denial because there's only one street left to come instead of two.
What are they doing with their draws on the turn?
Well, if you
Well,
said that they're bluffing or their draws on the flop, then they don't have too many draws on the turn.
Yeah, okay, so you would agree with that they would have bluffed them on the flop.
Remember, they're not going to be betting as a bluff unless they have some value. So it's really important for you to think about which value hands that they have that you beat when you have aces. And here, if you check how often they're going to bet, and so with a 5-6, we're definitely going to be raising, how successful your check raise is going to be.
Mm-hmm. On the flop.
Well, on the flop, with 5-6, you're doing as a bluff, so it's more important to think about which value hands you have. But here on the turn, we want to maximize the EV of our 5-6, right? Our nut hands.
Mm-hmm.
Are we going to win more by betting, or are we going to win more by check raising? Do we think that the two players behind us are going to bet enough the time for us to win more by checking and having them bet for us and us raise than betting ourselves?
Yeah, I think a bet is a better play because their flop play would have indicated that they don't have too many draws, and if they have any kind of hand they're going to continue with, it's going to have some kind of showdown value. Also on the flop, I would have expected them to probably put in a bet with their nutted hands because certainly fours, twos, and eights, pairs of fours, twos, and eights are in their range. And seeing I did not see that bet. Yeah, so I like a bet on the turn.
Yep, so do I. Betting is okay, and if you think that they're just going to bet for you after you check, then raising is okay. So both options are fine. And then when we get to the river, what's going on? So you get to the river, you continue bearish and bet, and then you get raised, and then you call.
Yep.
You end up losing this hand because they have Jack 10 somehow, but Jack 10 or 6-10, probably Jack 10.
Oh, they have Jack 10 of spades. Yeah.
Yeah, so Jack 10 of spades is the only hand that beats you really, because Jack 10 against a half pop out on the turn, just a gut shot without anything. So only one combination beats you here, right, of their entire range, which could have a bunch of stuff. And now we're heads up. So we're talking about heads up theory now. We're at a position with basically the nuts, where the nuts, that only loses to one combo. So like with top boat, that only loses to quads. That kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
What are we doing? Yeah. What's your decision to bet small here? Do you think that helps more of our opponent's stack?
No, I think actually a larger bet is probably the better call. I'm just trying to think of the value hands I'm going after. Yeah, I'm going after jacks. I'm going after tens.
We're going after a bunch of two pairs as well. Like they could have
a bunch of two pairs. Yeah, so we definitely got some eights,
if
7 nines. Yep.
the decision here this is going away from multi-way theory and talking about heads-up theory because we're a heads-up decision on the river. Thinking about a decision to shove all in, which we could do for the pot-sized shove pretty easily, versus a smaller size. When we have another hand like this, the reason to use a smaller size is to protect quote unquote protect our small size range against these shoves. So we only want to use this small size with this nutted hand if we think our opponent is going to shove with worse enough of the time to make up for that difference.
Mm-hmm.
Do we think our opponent is going to shove with worse if we bet small? Do you think our opponent's going to shove like 9-8 a lot of the time or 7-8? Probably, yeah. But do you think that that wins more than if we just shoved all in against them? I guess the question is I'm asking is if they have a 9-8 and 8-7 type hand, are they always getting it in against us? Or are they just calling sometimes? Because if they're always raising against us, then betting small is okay because we also get called by even weaker hands. And we also win because they always shove those hands against us.
Yeah, I think I see you're going with on this, and I think a larger bet makes sense because they're unlikely to shove with worse for value. And I could very well get called by worse if I make it a larger bet. There's really only one hand that's beating me here.
Yep.
So I might as well go.
So the question between shoving all in and using this small size is how often are they shoving two pair? Because when we shove, like what we're targeting is two pair and then some like 8 type hands or like a 9 something of diamonds that somehow gets here when we shove. If we bet small, do all of the hands that would have called us shove anyway?
No, they wouldn't.
No, they wouldn't. So if you think here, if we're betting small and an 8-7 doesn't shove, an 8-7 might not even be there because it might have raised the turn. Or like a 9-7, 9-4 type hand. Though if you think that those hands don't shove against our small bet, then shoving all in ourselves makes more sense. But if you think that they do, then betting small might be okay because we can call that shove, right? And we also get some extra value from some weaker hands.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So that's the difference in the decision.
Okay.
So if we think that these two pair hands aren't shoving after we bet small, then we should shove ourselves.
Yeah. No, I get that.
Lorenzo, did you have a question about this hand and sort of the thought process that I use in terms of analyzing this hand?
Yeah, I have one question. So on the flop, you don't like to bet. Did I understand correctly? For example, you have aces, or you have the nut part of your range that will be aces and kings, since you squeeze it against the early position. So if you have aces, kings, queens, you're not betting this flop.
Yeah. So we discussed one of the things that you can do if you're out of position multi-way against 2 or more players is to check everything, right? No matter what happened pre-flop. And part of that is because one of the 2 other guys is going to bet for us quite frequently. And so if we have aces, we want to get value from like jacks through kings or whatever. If we check, are they going to bet for us? And if the answer is yes, then do we really need to bet? Because if we bet, we're going to fold some of their range.
Thomas, what do you do with your aces? I mean, I think I know the answer to this, but it's a weird situation. If you got your aces and then you check and you get a bet call, it's back on you.
So here, if I check under the gun bets, button folds, then you can check raise your aces. So if you've got aces here.
Bet call?
So Oh, so if on the gun bets and the button calls, is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Okay, then you have to think about what the button's range is, and then you have to come over the top with that with a tighter range than both of the two players. So remember, first off, with our theory is that the if under the gun bets, the button's calling range has to be sort of similar to the undergun's value range because they can fold and let us bluff catch. So when we overcall or we squeeze, our range has to be much tighter than the undergun's value range. So you have to think about how wide is the undergun's value range. I'm not sure what those ranges are going to look like because of the strange preflop situation. But if the value is only over pairs and buttons calling only over pairs, then aces is not over pairs, so aces is the nuts. And so we're pretty happy to squeeze. But if they somehow have like all the sets here, then I'd be a lot less happy about that. And so you'd have to start folding some of the you
Thomas.
definitely yes.
Okay, in theory, I understood you. I understood the concept that you told me about the flop, but in practice, since the range is most likely to be kept and you have a lot of value that you can take from them, isn't it better to bet aces, kings? Because the majority of people here are gonna overcall here because their range will be pretty unelastic.
It's not whether they're going to overcall, or they're going to call more often against your bet. It's whether they're going to bet themselves if you check, right? Because say for here I want to bet pot or whatever, and then each player folds 70% of the time, whatever. Or so I'm getting 50% calls from the two other players. So if I bet pot, I get 50% calls. I've got aces, and I just say I win the pot. I win the pot plus their bet 50% of the time. But if I check and one of the other two players bets pot, and each of those two players always bets pot, then why should I ever bet pot with my aces? Because I'm guaranteed that one of the other two guys are going to bet pot. And so I can just raise my aces. I can check raise.
Yeah, this is also true.
This is what I'm saying, right? The way to win the value is by getting the other player to make a bet with a weaker hand, and then you raise them. That's why check raises are very strong. A very good thing to be doing out of position. So it's not just you bet and then you expect the guys to call more often. It's you have to balance that against if I checked, are they going to bet for me? Are they going to reopen the betting and I can raise? Or are they going to reopen the betting and I can call comfortably?
So if I think that these people are not going to bet,
yeah, if you think they're not going to bet often enough, then you definitely have to bet your aces. You definitely have to bet very wide in order to deny equity.
Because their range will be pretty face up. I mean, under the gun, most likely will have queens, jacks, tens, nines, eights, something like that. And of course, these are the part of the range that eats this board. And then he can have something like ace king offsuit, this kind of hands. Maybe king queen suited.
So they might end up betting their entire range really small, because they have an overpair. They want to deny equity. They have a 2 over card type hand. They want to use that to balance their overpair value as a bluff. So under the gun might end up betting their entire range very small if we checked. And so if we have aces, it doesn't make any sense for us to bet because under the gun's going to bet for us.
Yeah, I understood it.
And what's the thinking behind? I mean, the texture in particular. I mean, as Renzo said, it hits, some of the undergun range with overpairs and possibly a set of aces. The button could very well have all the sets in his range.
Yeah,
it's tough. It's tough to say because it doesn't really make sense for button to be here. After a squeeze pre-flop, after you call an RFI and then there's a squeeze and the RFI calls the squeeze, like you shouldn't call any hands, because the RFI's ranges should be too nutted there after they call. And
Yeah.
that comes into to the pre-flop strategy that we have with Zenith in terms of playing 3-bet or fold pre-flop. It makes these decisions a lot easier because these decisions don't exist in our strategy. We don't have to decide what happens against the squeeze after we've called the RFI, after the RFI calls, right? Because it's not in our strategy anymore, right? We don't lose EV, we don't hemorrhage EV out by calling pocket threes here, because it's not in our strategy to do that in the first place.
In practice, button could have set of 4s, 2 and 8, 9 combinations of nutted hands. Okay, maybe also 8-7, but there aren't many combinations. It's gonna call you with worse hands.
So in practice, if I had aces and I decided to check here and then under the gun bets and then button folds, I'd be very happy check raising the under the gun player.
Which range are you gonna check raise here? Especially as a bluff.
Oh, you can just check raise over cards with a flush draw, backdoor flush draw. You can, well, if you got the 5-6 here, you're definitely gonna do that because it's an open ender. So yeah, basically all the 5-6 as well. A bunch of the gut shots, which you have if you have them.
Yeah, okay, I understood because I don't have 5-6 and this kind of ends in my squeezing range against under the gun. I have mostly.
Yeah, I would have 5-6 if I was the big blind. Probably not so much as the small blind. Maybe a little bit of 5-6 in the small blind, just because 5-6 does really well against like a jacks plus a king sort of range. It does really well in terms of equity, but not as well out of position. So if I was a big blind and I squeezed, I would definitely have 5-6 in it.
Based on Poker Snowy's theories on squeezing, I made some ranges and they are mostly on the upper part of the range. I mean, in this scenario, I have 9s plus. I don't have 5-6, 6-7, 8-9, these kind of suited connectors. I made my ranges based on what Snowy is doing. And I don't know if you did the same, but I don't have many of these cards, so I don't hit these boards very often, but I don't care that much since they're not that frequent. So that's why I asked you what kind of hands you want to use as a bluff. And well, you told me the overcards with the flush draw, of course.
Yeah, so this is my small blind versus low jack and button, but big blind versus low jack and button looks like this. So it does have like these
Yeah.
hands some of the time, not very often, but some of the time, just to buff out the range a bit, which the small blind can't really do. One, because the small blind is paying a bit more, and two, because the big blind is there to come over the top as well.
Yeah.
So my ranges are based on both the Snowy as well as the Monka Sim. A little bit more. It's a combination of those two. So I think my ranges are pretty good for most people to use. As sort of like a default, and a lot of it ends up avoiding multi-way pots. Really, the only multi-way pots which you're going to get is when you're the open raiser, because we're raising small, and then you can get picked up by a few players in position against us, and so we just check everything, which is what we've discussed. Or if we're in the big blind and then we face an open, we're going to be calling reasonably wide if the small blind calls, and tighten up quite a bit if an in-position player calls. Like this is versus 3x. This is 2x.
2x.
Sorry, versus squeeze. Squeeze versus 2x. Big blind versus cutoff and button. You can see it's quite reasonably wide. But a lot of it is in the big blind. We're happy to overfold on the flop, like quite a large margin. Because if one of the other two players bet, we say we're big blind versus cutoff and button, right? And we call with these range. If the cutoff bets and the button folds, then we're just bluff catching in the stage, right? We're
Yeah.
the designated bluff catcher, so we bluff catch our range, but we can overfold because the cutoff had a lot of will probably have quite a range advantage against us still. But if cutoff checks, which they will a lot of the time because button's range is stronger than cutoffs, if cutoff checks and button bets, we're happy to fold the vast majority of our range because cutoff is a bluff catcher, and cutoff range is tighter, and they are the designated bluff catcher because they're the guy closing the action. And so because we're out of position against the two guys and we're not closing the action, we're going to play our range a lot closer to raise or fold, right? And if we do decide to call, we're going to have some traps that would 3-bet a cutoff squeeze.
Absolutely, yes.
All right, so we've been going for roughly 2 hours now. Does anyone have any questions about the what we've discussed so far? What we discussed in total?
Oh, I'm fine.
Yeah, no questions.
I'm good. Cutoff.
All right. In that case, if no one has any questions, we'll. Yeah. So if you're comparing my ranges to Snowy, so Snowy squeezes to 1 pot, and I'm squeezing a lot larger.
Yeah. Yeah, he's using 1 pot.
So versus the 3. Yeah, mine's tighter because buttons should be tighter than Snowy's. Snowy flats pretty wide in the button versus an open.
Okay, I made them like this. Right now, I'm using this stuff.
Yeah, so you can definitely swap over to what I've got. I think you'll find it a bit easier to play.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess so, man.
All right. Well, if you have no more questions about the theory in multi-way pots, I think we'll call that a successful tutorial. I hope you guys learned quite a lot from this. And
Yeah, it was great. It was great.
so
I certainly did, Thomas.
Hope to see you guys at the next one.
Yeah, very good tutorial, Thomas. I learned quite a bit, and yeah, keep up the good work.
Thank you. All right, I'll see you guys later.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you.